Sly Cooper is a product of a very unique period in gaming history. Throughout the late 90s, mascot platformers were very big, but a different crop of games also had started to attract attention. Titles that brought characters to life with considered vocal performances and stylish cinemas. Blockbuster action titles with characters who gained relatability by inhabiting more contemporary settings. Alongside that came the rise of stealth games to prominence, titles about characters using subterfuge and cunning to accomplish their goals. Boot up 2002's Sly Raccoon, and you're immediately taking control of an anthropomorphic animal, smashing objects and collecting giant floating coins. But not on some wacky cartoon planet, but in present-day Paris, while cast credits fade onto the screen, emphasizing that character will be driving this game as well as mechanics. What follows is a stylish game, pulling from all sides of mainstream late 90s gaming, if perhaps arriving a little late to be fully appreciated in the early 2000s, where a new landscape of titles was growing with different proclivities altogether. Nevertheless, here stands the first Sly game, setting the stage with a darker premise than you might expect for a title about a thieving raccoon. Years after the murder of his parents, career thief Sly Cooper sets out to retrieve family heirlooms from gangsters who took out his also criminal family. He's helped by two friends from his orphanage days while being chased down by a tenacious inspector. It's a setup perfect for a globe-trotting adventure with a healthy list of locations and different bosses, but it's also perfect for the player to get to control a highly motivated main character, looking to prove himself, get even, and show up the competition.
But rain or shine, I'm gonna steal my family's book back, and if Raleigh gets in my way, it's on.
Sly Cooper's motivations are both noble and selfish, perfect for a cheeky thief who needs to be cunning yet likable. He plays off his partner in crime Bentley perfectly, a by-the-book techie who will radio in to guide Sly through each mission. Since he's the character Sly will be talking to the most, their contrasting character is a welcome one and contributes to solid banter.
Sorry, Sly, but this is one mission you will have to accomplish without me.
You don't believe in ghosts, do you?
Sure I do. My scanners have picked up verifiable paranormal activity. But that's not the problem. This swamp is oozing with disgusting mold and bacteria.
Making Carmelita, the cop in pursuit of Sly, his love interest as well, is also a genius stroke. The two get to both fight and flirt throughout the game, keeping you on your toes as to where their rivalry is gonna go next.
A girl whose best friend's a firearm's got issues. A little dinner, a little dancing. I think I can help you out.
Sounds romantic, as long as you don't mind dining in jail.
Nah, I hear the service is lousy.
Everything leads up to a conclusive chapter that makes the most of these dynamics. Turns out the final member of the gang that killed Cooper's parents isn't just another gangster, but a cyborg monstrosity, an entity keeping itself alive out of hatred for the Cooper line of master thieves. This raising of the stakes forces Bentley to come out of his shell and save Sly, while Carmelita must team up with Sly if they stand a chance of getting out alive. Even for a platformer with a darker premise than some, this final chapter is still a bit of a shock. The soundtrack grows more ominous and dark, invaded by chanting, as Sly approaches the inner sanctum of a villain so surprisingly twisted conceptually.
You will never be rid of me. Clockwork is superior.
This underdog story is reflected well in the gameplay. Sly is agile yet brittle. Taking on this series of bosses requires constant evasion. Being able to take so few hits before the boss falls makes the success all the more satisfying, as it feels like skilled, crafty finesse led you to victory. This is where the game's stealth DNA comes into play, as many enemies deliver brutal punishment but can be circumvented entirely if you avoid their sights. One big advantage stealth gameplay has in this abstract, cartoony setting is that the exact range of enemy vision cones can be fed to the player very clearly by being represented with the light of their torch. This means the player doesn't have to play a guessing game as to where the enemy can see, but the game doesn't have to resort to an entirely separate display like a radar to do the job either. This keeps the player's attention on the game world. Making Sly so weak gives the stealth some decent bite, but with or without those stealth elements, I'd say that frailness is also the only way to make platforming this easy challenging. Press the circle button while in the air and Sly will home in on various objects in the environment. As long as nothing touches you on the way over, that circle button press will guarantee you'll land on your next target, if it's a ledge, hook, pole, spire-like, or rail-like. With such a large focus on these interaction points, Sly reveals itself to be a platformer much more about timing than precision. The result isn't bad in segments that combine these homing points with a healthy amount of regular platforms. The game can feel a little basic when big strings of circle button homing points come back to back though. Interestingly, before release, the game was designed to require different button presses depending on the type of objects homed in on, rather than just the circle button. But this was changed.
Before we had the control scheme worked out, you had to use different buttons to land with your feet and grab with your hook, and it would just explode your mind to try and play this level because you're trying to run away from this giant snake and still remember to hit the circle for this and the square for that or whatever it was. But I just remember it being very sort of exhausting to play in its original control scheme.
I think there's more arguments for why this was a bad change rather than a good one. One is, of course, that an added element of challenge would probably be welcome in this game. You can make the argument that being chased by a giant snake while performing complex athletic jumps should exhaust a player a little. More importantly though, having each homing point require a different button would reduce the chances of latching onto something you don't want to. This isn't such a big problem in the first game, where most of the content is relegated to linear levels that limit the amount of places you'd want to move to. The sequels focus on open areas though, where there are usually multiple paths to take at any one time. Here it can be annoying to have Sly latch onto where you don't want to thanks to that universal attach button. Granted, making each homing point correspond to a different button wouldn't give you more control when choosing between jumping points of the same type, but it's hard to imagine the games not being marginally better if they had stuck to the original plan. It's worth pointing out that for the most part, the homing system does intuit where you want to go quite well, but its imperfections are worth commenting on. Imperfections or not, one thing the more open levels do in 2 and 3 is offer this forgiving platforming more depth. Now when homing on to a jumping point, it's not just a question of waiting for the right time, but also choosing a path through the level that serves your current objective. This does speak to the biggest problem with the Sly Trilogy's gameplay though. It expands on everything around Sly without iterating on him a whole lot. The first game suffers from an overabundance of minigames with little to do with the core play, but what's interesting is that this never really changes in the rest of the series. What changes is that after the first game, the series manages to shed its 90s platformer framework of collecting X amount of power stars to enter the next area, to creating more compelling context for these non-core activities. Shoot a bunch of crabs or light a bunch of torches for some generic key, and the whole task feels arbitrary and like padding. On the other hand, throw in a dance minigame but frame it around Sly incognito dancing with Carmelita, and the charm carries it. Throw in a shooter section but have it be an interesting matchup between two fun characters, and the player will be more invested. Even a boring, bog-standard turret segment can be lent a certain energy if you're playing as an old boss gaining respect for one of your teammates' level of willpower.
I will never leave her behind again!
Would that I had such passion when they came from my little Jing King.
Have a minigame be a domino in some ludicrously elaborate heist, and the comedy of it all can be enough to make the segment land.
La 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 la!
And hey, using good context to justify a radical shift in gameplay is something Sly 1 already had examples of. The demanding rhythm game in the Miss Ruby fight would be an egregious inclusion as some arbitrary activity for a key, but have the pressure of these timed button presses grow more and more intense in anticipation of getting Sly in smacking range of one of his parents' murderers, and it works. I guess it's worth questioning if trying to justify a large array of minigames and shifts away from core mechanics is something worth applauding in the sequels. If it's in service of creating a unique experience, then I'd say it's a success. But if it's in service of creating a great platformer, I think we can safely say that after the first game, The Sly games aren't interested in that anymore. It becomes a multi-genre heist series with the cartoon presentation lending to some truly outrageous scenarios it's fun to just bear witness to. From cheating at lumberjack games in outlandish ways to having to undermine the competition so Sly can win a team dogfight in only one plane, Sly 2 and 3 do a great job at constructing large-scale operations for the team to set up and carry out, and they pace themselves well, with just enough successes and plans going awry to keep you guessing as to where things are going, and how the team will get back on track when a spanner is thrown into the works. Creative context saves the Sly games from being a collection of shallow activities, but it's also probably the biggest burden placed on the second two games. To justify every wild new activity, you often have to sit through reams of unskippable dialogue explaining the situation. Not so bad when the conversation is laced with character building or good jokes, but that's not the case for every briefing in the game. It's a double-edged sword because while Sly 2 and 3 are far more unique, the lazy context of Sly 1 ultimately reduces interruptions and probably makes it the one of the three that's most alluring to pick up and replay. You might also pick up the original to just avoid being assaulted with horns for 12 hours. While the main Sly theme 2 creates is inspired and immediately iconic, after playing Sly 2 and 3 back to back, I never want to be hyped up in battle by brass instrumentation again. Even as Sly's core moveset lacks development, it still overshadows any new characters that become available as the titles continue. He remains the most versatile character, and while 3 does its best to even the odds a bit, it can't change that planting bombs or mashing simple punch combos in the streets below a series of curated platforming challenges is never going to allow those alternate styles of gameplay to develop or truly shine, when they're never going to get that same focus. Yet their presence at all negates the need to develop Sly's mechanics much further from where they were in 1. Each game boasts a series of optional upgrades, but you'll probably unlock them too late for them to contribute much to missions that don't tend to factor them in anyway. Framing all the character imbued into this trilogy as just an excuse for shallow gameplay is selling it short, of course. The personality these games exude is immediately apparent from only a few seconds of play, and drips from the trilogy until the final boss. The exaggerated cartoon movement gives characters personality to spare, from the way they sneak or hide or react to being chosen in the character select. As the trilogy ramps up, characters grow a lot, expressing themselves in animation, in wardrobe, and of course in dialogue. The Sly Trilogy devotes a lot of time to character building, and if there's one thing this series does consistently, it's pay off these arcs in gameplay. We can argue back and forth about the mechanical depth of each individual moment, but when those bricks are stacked up, the Sly Trilogy towers over all with carefully constructed payoffs that would be any other game's defining moment, except here they keep happening back to back. Mari's transformation from nervous team driver to pumped-up brawler between games may be a bit sudden, but after a whole game of being on the sidelines, getting to see him save Sly by excelling in a field all his own is very satisfying.
All I see is a fat, pathetic weakling. I might be big and not as smart as the other guys, but one thing I'm not is weak.
That field being taking on a powerful opponent with zero subterfuge. Likewise, locking away the rest of the team and forcing the physically weakest and most neurotic team member to save them is all around terrific character growth for everyone involved.
I hear you, Blizzard.
No, Sly, I'm the wizard, and you're sitting duck.
I read you loud and clear, Lizard.
No, I'm... Forget it, you're not taking this seriously. If you can't count on a friend to bust you out of jail, what kind of a friend are they?
Truer words were never said, Wizard.
Both scenarios pushing the player into an unexpected situation where they must play their part and play it well to finish said mini-arc. You may just find drawn-out missions as a fragile turtle sneaking around worth it, when it pays off with that same turtle having to bumble his way to victory against the strongest boss in the game. Sly 2 puts focus on the team effort, the gang barely managing to hold itself together as they complete daring heists to win back the parts of the monster cyborg they beat at the end of the previous title. Sly 3's biggest triumph is bringing the subject matter of the first two games together to deliver on a conclusive final message that speaks to the themes of the entire trilogy. If the first game was about the past, one legacy's catching up with you and getting you into trouble, having to wade through it, and the second game was about forging a brotherhood through many ups and downs, then 3 is when those two themes collide. Sly's family fortune is hidden in a vault that a mastermind is already trying to crack into. That mastermind, Dr. M, turns out to be the Bentley equivalent from Sly's dad's gang, who grew resentful of Sly's father, feeling underappreciated and undervalued for his role in that previous Cooper gang. Something I like is that the game never takes a hard stance on whether Sly's father was an asshole to M or if M's ego simply made him grow resentful of his flashy leader. Either could be true, but the point here isn't to cast judgment on those who came before, but to make the most of the present they left behind. M can't get over the past, but Sly, despite how much his identity is tied to his ancestry, is able to break free of that. Sly's approach is the polar opposite to M's. While M locks himself away alone on an island ordering minions around to get into the Cooper Vault, Sly travels the world, making connections to help him break past M's defenses. Sly even manages to set aside his hatred for one of the bosses of the first game, involved with the death of his parents, to add him as a teammate, making M's grudge against Sly's father, real or imagined, look petty by comparison. Appropriately, Sly's relationship with his teammates is put under more strain than before in this adventure. Murray has to be given his confidence back to be convinced to rejoin after feeling responsible for Bentley getting crippled at the end of the second game. Of course, defending his friends is what gets him his mojo back.
That does it!
Bentley himself has insecurities to deal with. Insecurities that end up putting him on a dangerously similar path to M.
Do you ever feel like you're playing second fiddle to Sly?
I like how Sly doesn't really have a scene where he directly reassures Bentley how important he is to him. Bentley's able to reflect on his relationship with Sly without a big moment with Sly there to guide him. He can't blame Sly for insecurities he has to overcome. His final reality check doesn't come from the philosophers or strategists of the team, but from someone who doesn't care to get lost in the intricacies of a situation.
Think of it this way, Bentley. If it were you in that vault and Sly and I were out here, what would he do?
Stop these thugs and protect his friend.
It's all about opening your eyes and just seeing what's in front of you. Maybe Sly doesn't have to be tied to the past, to his legacy, if it gets in the way of his happiness.
I might be part of all this, a member of the Cooper line, but in the end, I'm just me. Not Henriette, Thaddeus, Slight and Common, Ryoichi, or my father. Just Sly.
And I guess it's easy to realize that when confronted with the embodiment of not letting go. In the end, Sly puts aside his life of crime and pretends to have amnesia. Carmelita puts aside her duty to capture Sly by pretending he's always been her partner.
Who am I?
You're my partner, Constable Cooper.
Just apply the Murray's observations about Sly and Bentley's relationship to Sly and Carmelita's. Sure, Sly's a criminal and Carmelita a cop, but look at the basic reality in front of you. These two stop at nothing to save each other in a pinch. And that's the real relationship, right?
Hold on, Ringtail.
Just as Sly and Bentley are friends first and leader and teammate second, Sly and Carmelita perhaps mean something else to each other first and their roles in society second. Throughout the series, a lot of the villains have something in common. They were hard done in their past and spend the rest of their lives consumed by revenge and ambition. In a way, though, this is something Sly has just as much in common with them too. Another criminal with a tragic past. But before it's too late, he's able to reassess and get out before being consumed. It's the perfect message to wrap up this franchise's collection of stories about so many characters caught up in the past. Luckily for Sly, unlike many of his villains, he's anchored by his loved ones in his pursuit of revenge and fortune, and they end up being more important than those initial objectives. It's fair to say this is where the Sly series runs out of road, whether the developers at Sucker Punch had decided to make the ending this definitive or not. Keep in mind, the depth of the characters and story in these titles is impressive by any game's standards, not just that of cartoon animal games. But there does come a point where that style is going to hold you back. You can have a panda reflect on his insecurities in a mirror.
Cooper is a teacher of humility. We have slain his parents, yet he manages to trust us. By studying him, we will become whole. I have no desire to join with my weaker side.
Or muse on the impact of the legacy our ancestors leave behind. But there's a lot of adult topics that you can't really tackle in a serious way when making an all-ages cartoon platformer owned too by one of the biggest publishers in the world, no matter how close they try to get. The Sly Trilogy, with the finale of 3, pushed the cartoon mascot game beyond where I think many would have thought possible. And it's not just the ending, of course, there's heavy subject matter present all over this game. Crippling a main character and having that disability carry over into his gameplay in the next title shows a dedication to try to grapple with as much heavy adult subject matter as you can within the world of Sly, and somehow have it factor into gameplay too. Sly 3 should be commended for that achievement, but it's also where the cracks start to show in this ambition elsewhere. While Sly 3 is home to some of the best moments in the trilogy, it also is home to some of the worst. Despite a well-executed brawl where we switch between the three mains mid-fight as a last send-off before the Cooper gang starts expanding beyond this trio.
This is tense! Sly, you okay?
Right as rain, pal.
Rumble Down Under probably ranks as one of the worst chapters in the series, as the urge 3 games in to come up with the most outlandish scenarios possible for the cartoon heist game starts butting up against the series' more serious storytelling goals. In isolation, you may think Murray thinning out the opposition by being told to hurl guards into the mouth of a giant alligator is just a ridiculous cartoon scenario. But if you're trying to take the plot seriously at this point, it's Murray being told to go on a killing spree against a group of, I guess, kind of asshole miners. You wonder why the Cooper gang don't just hire a sniper to put on the team at that point. Then you have the villain of the chapter being a magical mask that turns Carmelita into a possessed, rampaging giant for the final fight. A scenario that's so stupid and ridiculous that adds really nothing to the story or character relationships as a whole. You're better off just forgetting it happened if you want to take the later romance stuff seriously. A ghost or two in a one-off mission I can take. I could even accept a dragon here and there. I mean, this is a world of talking animals. But a main character being turned into a rampaging giant as the final conflict of a chapter is too far. Even the final chapter, for all its great hard-hitting moments, can't help but be dragged down by Dr. M's lineup of weird mutant minions. The interesting dynamic of M technically owning the island the Cooper Vault is on, making his activity legal, is perhaps undermined by him having giant mutants there too. Contextually, in terms of theme and character, we've reached the limits of what the Sly world can accomplish by the end of 3, and it's arguably the same case for the gameplay. Again, Sucker Punch expanded everything surrounding Sly rather than Sly himself, whether it be non-core activities or different playable characters, all of which 3 packs on more than any other game in the series. As a result, mechanically, as an action-adventure platforming character, Sly himself stagnates. The series early on becomes aware that there's only so much you can do with his moveset. There are some cool one-off twists that come and go, but that's about it. Making any more Sly beyond here would require a total rethink of his control from the ground up for it not to be repetitive. 'Cause what's the alternative? Even more minigames and alternate forms of play to complement Sly? 3 was already pushing things on that front. If you're butting up against the maximum thematic depth a franchise's world and characters have to offer, and a back-to-basics rethink of the core mechanics and rhythm of play is needed to elongate things further, it makes a lot more sense to start something fresh, where prior expectations need not apply, right? And that's what Sucker Punch did. Infamous uses the basic formula of Sly in many ways, with the same style of presentation, comic book segments, in-engine cutscenes where characters stand around and gesture like robots learning what emotions are. It focuses on the relationships different people have with a man jumping around on rooftops. A new main character with a new set of abilities, though, gives Sucker Punch the opportunity to more freely go back to the drawing board and create added depth. Having the combat be shooter-focused now allows the platforming and fighting to happen in tandem more harmoniously. The new freeform style of climbing and platforming, in conjunction with the shooting elements, permits a greater degree of freedom when approaching conflict. Getting from point A to point B without Sly's generous auto-correcting homing forces you to gauge distance more carefully. The game can still somewhat misjudge where you wanted to land or what you wanted to grab onto, but you're less likely to be drastically taken off the path you wanted, without the ability to magnetize yourself to objects so far away. With a human cast and more adult setting, the title can deal with darker subject matter. Main characters can be killed off, and our heroes can face tougher trials. Ironically, the first Infamous doesn't quite offer the character depth of something like Sly 3, despite that. But it would be unfair to compare one game to Sly 3, which has 2 other titles worth of material to work off. In fact, the one downside of using a less abstract world is you have to take even more time to carry out certain story arcs. In Sly, a character can just feign amnesia and be admitted into the police force, but to execute a similar character beat in something angling less cartoony, you'd have to put in a lot more work and time. This is probably why the Sly games were so good at rattling off great character moments fast. The cartoonishness is very pliable for getting characters into fun situations, at the cost of the range of themes you can tackle in this style. There's certainly an argument to be had about whether the Infamous series ever managed to reach the heights of Sly 3's final chapter with its characters and story. But even if you thought it didn't, it's important to not take that as an indication there was better material to be mined by having Sucker Punch do more Sly. Sly 3 only reaches the peak that it does at the end because of its conclusiveness. That conclusiveness carries a certain weight required to make a message about letting go work. Moving on was an obligatory move no matter how well future projects turned out. Perhaps for players as well. The first Sly was released when the mass popularity of the mascot adventure platformer type game, inspired by the likes of Mario and Sonic, was trailing off. And by 2005, Sly 3 was kind of the final title, still carrying that flag, while other series either died or tried adapting their style for new tastes. In Sly 3, the Cooper line of thieves comes to the end, but also an era of gaming comes to an end. Sucker Punch pushed the talking animal game to its thematic limits, and then when out of breath they dropped a definitive ending, as if to say that these types of cartoon characters have given you all they can, and it's time to move on. As someone who started gaming as a child in the late 90s and early 2000s, this ending felt like an invitation to move on to more adult titles entering my teen years. A challenge for the player to move on, and as discussed, a challenge for the company itself too. Sly Cooper the Guy was a product of a long line of predecessors, just as Sly Cooper the Game was the product of a long line of titles in gaming. But wouldn't it be fun to start something new and fresh without that past baggage? Stop dressing in your dad's suits and find your own. The series had to end for that, but of course they could never end the Sly series by killing the cute raccoon mascot Sony owned. So they did the closest thing they could to that. Sly Cooper isn't dead, but Sly Cooper the Thief is. Just don't feel too sad about it, because he doesn't.
Come in, Cooper Gang, come in! Do not watch TGB Sly Analysis! Watch B-Mask's videos! They're much better! He has a better grasp of the intricacies... never mind, it's too late now anyway.